Comerciales, y aprovechando que el doctor Carlos Braga vino a dar un curso al diplomado, pues creímos que era una buena idea el tener una conferencia magistral. Y una conferencia magistral, ya vieron el título, quiero decir, el doctor Braga habla portuñol, así que dará su intervención, la hará en inglés. Las preguntas pueden ser en español. Quiero presentarles al doctor Braga. Es ingeniero aeronáutico en la Universidad en el Instituto Tecnológico de Aeronáutica. Luego vio la luz e hizo un máster en economía. Luego todavía vio más la luz, esto lo hizo en Sao Paulo, e hizo el doctorado en economía en la Universidad de Illinois. Ha ocupado muy altos puestos en el Banco Mundial. Ha sido, por ejemplo, el director de deuda, o sea, un puesto muy, muy importante. Mira, es más fácil así. Okay. ¿Empiezo? Decía que ha ocupado muy altos puestos en el Banco Mundial. Estuvo como director para Europa, como decía, director de deuda en esa dirección. Estuvo, en fin, ha tenido muchísima experiencia en esta área y es uno también en la materia en comercio y desarrollo del Banco Mundial. Fue el secretario del Comité de Desarrollo del Banco Mundial, OCDE, en fin. Banco Mundial, Fondo Monetario Internacional, my mistake. Pero bueno, ya no, iba a contar la anécdota con Gurría, pero en fin, no lo haré. Y después, cuando se retiró del Banco Mundial, fue a Lausanne, al lado de Ginebra, a una institución de posgrado muy importante, se llama el IMD. No sé lo que quiere decir IMD, pero okay, that's it. Y luego ya volvió a Brasil y ahora está como investigador, profesor en la Fundación Don Cabral, que es una de las grandes fundaciones en Brasil. Entonces, pues, Carlos.
Gracias, Fernando. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say, every time that I'm invited to give a talk that they call Conferencia Magistral, I get very nervous because I ask myself, who is going to show up for a Conferencia Magistral? It reminds me of a story, which is a true story of a friend, a neighbor of you guys, José Maria Figueiras, the former president of Costa Rica. He studied at West Point and came back to Costa Rica. He got a degree in chemical engineering, if I'm not wrong. And immediately after that, he wrote a paper and submitted to a conference in Canada. It was the first paper that he had written, and he was very happy that the paper was accepted. So he goes to this conference in a city in the middle of Canada, a huge conference center. The moment comes for him to give the paper, this auditorium for 600 people. There was one guy sitting in the auditorium. He said, well, c'est la vie. He presented the paper. The guy applauded. And then he's leaving. And the guy says, where are you going? I said, oh, I'm going to the cocktail. No, no, you have to stay because I'm giving the other paper, the next paper. So I'm very happy to see that we have an audience. And what I'm going to talk a little bit is this topic, which is something that Fernando, myself, and many other people have dedicated part of their professional lives, which is the multilateral system. And let me explain what do I mean by multilateral system. So here is one definition. There are many others. But multilateralism, in my mind, is this set of institutions that help manage growing economic interdependence. You could call it globalization, that help to promote peaceful cooperation among the nations, economic openness, the provision of global public goods, and respect for individual rights, and you could even extend to democracy too. So you can immediately think of institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, and I'll be focusing mainly on the trade component. But just to put things in perspective, what you probably saw that I called the presentation, The Death of Multilateralism, ? So at the end, I'll give you my impression, because Fernando wanted me to take the ? to be very precise. But as I'm going to explain, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And what I'm going to do is I'll make 5 points. I'm a big fan of a psychologist called George Miller. He was a professor at Harvard that in 1956 he published a paper that is the most quoted paper in psychology, in academic literature. And this paper is called 7 plus or less 2, the magic number. Why? Because it's a paper about memory. And this guy, George Miller, was one of the first psychologists to study how our memory works, particularly short-term memory. And the basic point of the paper is that typically in our short-term memory, we can remember 7 chunks of information. Brilliant people like Fernando, +2, 9. People like me, just 5. That's why I have 5 points to share with you. So the first point is one that it will not be a surprise, the fact that we are living in a moment that there are many second thoughts about the benefits of globalization, and there is lots of anxiety in the world economy. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit how we went from the end of history, to borrow from Fukuyama, in the early 1990s, to the revival of populism nowadays. Then I'm going to explore very quickly the role of technology in this process, and then I'm going to focus on what I'm characterizing here as the return of the protectionists, and I'll finalize exactly with one example of where we have a significant problem of governance, which is the case of the WTO. So that's the game plan. But of course, as anything in life, you could say that it all depends on your perspective. If I were to ask you, what do you see in this picture? What would be the answer? A lady, young or old? Young. Yeah, I know why you see the old, but so who focus here probably seeing a young lady, right? Who focus here? This is the mouth, this is the nose, are probably seeing an old lady, right? So Fernando only sees the old lady, but okay. Okay. So as I'm going to point out, it depends a lot on the perspective that you take. You could argue that multilateralism as we know it, or as we knew it in the post-World War II period, is in very bad shape, but maybe this is the beginning of a new era. And I will make some arguments in this direction. But unfortunately, and I don't like to do this, I feel a little bit what in English we call mixed feelings. No? My definition of mixed feelings is when you see your mother-in-law go over a cliff with your brand new BMW. So, but I'm gonna tell you already what is my take. My take is that unfortunately, the Trump administration has done irreparable damage to the system that existed. And it's not going to be a simple question of whoever comes next. But I will discuss why this is the case. And my basic message, it's not original. Many people in international relations have made this point before, is that in reality what we saw in the post-World War II period in terms of multilateral institutions was a kind of unique situation, because the United States took on itself to be a reluctant sheriff for the rest of the world, and this had very important implications in terms of how nations behaved. Nowadays, this has changed. I know that speaking this about the United States in Mexico always raises some questions, but I will explain why this was a very different moment in the history of mankind in a moment, okay? So, second thoughts about the benefits of globalization. This class that I'm teaching about globalization and trade agreements, and several of the participants here have already heard me talking about things like this, that if you want to understand globalization, the best thing is to look at this picture. You have here North Korea and South Korea. You can see the difference in terms of the infrastructure. This is a picture from satellite in the evening, and you can see the difference, right? Obviously, in the South, you have a country that embraced globalization. In the North, you have probably the most closed economy in the world. And you can see at the same time is a nuclear power. You can do this, but you can see that in reality, we don't have, North Korea is not a member of the World Bank or the IMF. We don't have good statistics, but you can see that luminosity is a good proxy for development. And in reality, it has declined by 40% between 2013 and 2015. So at the same time that North Korea is having these developments with nuclear weapons and in terms of, let's say, projecting power in the Asian region, it is a country that I would suggest nobody would like to live there unless you are, of course, in the family of Mr. Kim. But even those sometimes don't have a very good treatment. So this is the world, okay? You can see Mexico with a $1.1 trillion economy. You can see the United States is still as the largest economy, but China already by far the second largest economy. And this has to do with the change that we are seeing in the world economy. It's a world that is much more peaceful than what we have seen for most of the 20th century. So although, of course, if we think Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, we'll say, well, this is a very difficult situation. If we compare with World War II or Korea, for that matter, the Korean War, the situation in terms of interstate conflict has improved dramatically. It's a world where extreme poverty has declined significantly. Of course, this data has to be interpreted with care because we are using proxies going back to the 19th century. But in any case, the level of development in the world economy with obvious inequalities has improved significantly, to the point that for the first time in the history of mankind, we have as many people in what we could characterize as middle class. This is a definition here: families that spend between 100 and 110, or $11 and $110 per day in purchasing power parity exchange rate per individual. This is what Homi Karas and colleague have characterized as middle class. So for the first time in the history of mankind, we have as many people in middle class and the rich as poor people and vulnerable people. So it's an amazing development if we put in historical terms. And one thing that most people would be surprised is that in reality, inequality at global level has been declining. All of us have the impression that inequality is increasing, but just think, the process of growth of countries like China and India has been so dramatic that if you are going to make comparisons between countries, in reality, global inequality has declined, because the only way that you can make this comparison is identifying the average India or the average Chinese and comparing with the average Mexican, the average American, and in this way you can calculate an index. Here it's the tail coefficient, but you can think like a Gini coefficient. In reality, at global level is declining. Now, it's quite true that for most industrialized countries, inequality has been increasing. In Latin America, notwithstanding, you can see it's the green points here in the graph. Most countries, including Mexico, inequality has declined, okay? Of course, probably because it could not get worse, right? Latin America was the most unequal continent in the world. But overall, what we see is the situation that in the industrialized countries, inequality has been increasing, and in China, in India, Latin America being to a certain extent an exception. So this is basically to tell you the following. If you look at these numbers, and I could give you indicators about health, about life expectancy, about literacy, we are in a much better world than was the case, let's say, 50 years ago. And yet, and of course, globalization, growing interdependence was very much associated with this process. And yet, if you ask people, is globalization a force for good or for bad? And as you can see, in Asia, most people, and particularly in countries that could be characterized either as communist countries or interventionist countries, typically you see much more support for globalization than, for instance, in places like the United States or France, for that matter, right? So how we explain this? Well, one interesting aspect is what has happened with the world economy between 1988 and 2008. So let's say the golden period of globalization to a certain extent. And you can see that in terms of the income distribution, that everybody benefited. But the people who benefited the most were the top 1%, or what nowadays we can characterize as the Asian middle class, particularly in China, right? While the middle class in the United States and in Western Europe, particularly the lower middle class, is not that overall they did not benefit from globalization, but they benefited much less. And this is part of the explanation about this angst, this anxiety that I mentioned to you, because it's also anxiety about rapid change, right? In geopolitical terms, the center of gravity of the world economy has been shifting dramatically. It was in the Mesopotamia, when Jesus Christ was born. You can see that it gradually moved in the direction of the West. The dots, the blue dot is the center of economic gravity of the world. You can see that by the end of World War II was basically North America. The United States alone was roughly 40% of world GDP. And then with the reconstruction of Europe, the reconstruction of Japan, began to migrate in the direction of the East again. But what I would like to call your attention is this jump here between 2000 and 2010. Never in history we saw a change with this dramatic development with such a velocity. And the explanation is very simple. One word, China, right? And this, of course, is creating tensions in terms of the geopolitical system and equilibrium of power in the world economy. It's enough to mention that China between 2011 and 2013 consumed more cement than the United States in the whole of the 20th century. Of course, this is not sustainable. Of course, China is decelerating, but these changes are dramatic. If you add to this the question of the adoption of technology, the velocity with which new technologies are impacting the world, for instance, it took 68 years for us to have the first 50 million clients in airplanes. It took 19 days to get 50 million people playing Pokemon, okay? I know that all of you play Pokemon, so it's a good example. So these kind of things create this situation of anxiety, and I like very much what Hal Varian, the chief economist of Google, former professor at Berkeley, once said in 2013. 1 billion hours ago, Homo sapiens emerged. 1 billion minutes ago, Christianity began. 1 billion seconds ago, the IBM personal computer was launched. 1 billion Google searches ago was this morning. This gives you an idea of how, let's say, the world that we are living is a world characterized by velocity. All of this, the geopolitical change and also the dramatic velocity of technological change have contributed to an environment that has been leveraged by political developments that have increased significantly the uncertainty in terms of the world economy. What is going to happen? I don't know if you are following Wall Street today and yesterday, the gyrations in terms of stock exchange, the tweets of Mr. Trump blaming the press and things like that. But the reality is that we are in a world characterized by very high levels of uncertainty. And that characterizes what I have called, and many others, the age of anxiety. We are more and more in a period characterized by uncertainty, be it because of technology, be it because of pests like Ebola, Zika, Trump, be it by unknown unknowns, things like terrorism, things like geopolitical shocks. Who could imagine that Russia would invade Crimea in 2014? So all of this, of course, create this environment for anxiety. And this is associated with this progress in terms of how we look at history over the last few years. The first thing to remember is that you could argue that to a certain extent what we are seeing is a return to normality. These are the numbers, proxies from Angus Madison, probably the best known economic historian, in terms of the size of world economies over time. And as you can see, as recently as the 18th century, China and India were the largest economies in the world. And then we had the dramatic decline of these two economies, be it because of colonization, be it because of external influences and interventions. All of this led to the situation that we are more familiar with at the end of World War II, with the United States by far the largest economy in the world. Then the recovery of Europe, and of course, we began to see, here the data goes only to 1998, but as you know, by now, in reality, if we make the calculation in purchasing power parity, meaning if we control for the cost of living in different economies, China is already bigger than the United States. So how the world evolved, taking us from a much more conflictive world to what I would characterize as the Pax Americana. In reality, we had a previous period that we could characterize as an experiment into a liberal world, which is the period between 1815, the defeat of Napoleon, till World War I, that people typically characterize as the period of the Pax Britannica. So the UK had a position of hegemony, particularly with respect to its navy, and in order to advance and to protect its interests in its global empire, it fostered a relatively open international economic order and the promotion of liberal values, of course, outside the colonies, and to a certain extent, this postponed hegemonic conflicts. Of course, we had many wars in the 19th century, but you didn't have major hegemonic wars in this period. By the early 20th century, however, we were in a situation with the ascent of a unified Germany and also of Japan in Asia. This began to challenge the British supremacy. And World War I, to a certain extent, illustrated the limits of this first liberal order. A conflict not only between the liberal strategy characterized by the British Empire, the German culture, with much more emphasis on duty, order, and justice and a strong state, and the left, of course, with the communist revolution in Russia. So all of this challenged the liberal order, and attempts that happened after World War I in terms of trying to rebuild the liberal order, including creating institutions like the League of Nations, didn't go very far. The interesting thing to keep in mind is that at that point in time, there were some voices in the United States, and this may come as a surprise to you, but even people like Theodore Roosevelt that were in favor of the United States taking a much stronger position in terms of rebuilding this liberal order, in terms of being one of the joint guarantors of world peace. But this didn't go very far. In reality, as you probably are aware, the United States did not join the League of Nations. And if you add to this the fact that the winning nations in Europe took a very revanchist position that led to the Versailles Treaty, you paved the way for fascism and, to a certain extent, to World War II. Now, the United States changed its position dramatically after Pearl Harbor. So for the first time, the United States, if we think in world terms, not in terms of North America, because of course it had a much more interventionist attitude in terms of North America, but in terms of the world, for the first time the United States realized that it could be influenced significantly by what was happening in the rest of the world. And then, with the victory at the end of World War II, then the United States launched the basis for what I call the post-World War II liberal world, which is the world that we are familiar with, and the institutions that I characterize as the pillars of multilateralism and that have prevailed till recently. So, but it's important to remember, first, as Ambrose Bierce in the 19th century said, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography, because they are not very good at that. Actually, in the middle of the current situation with Ukraine, there is a very interesting experiment that it was done in the United States, where a poll was made asking first people to identify where Ukraine was located. And the great majority had no clue, okay? They would put Ukraine in Latin America, in Australia, in Africa, not in Eastern Europe. But then the most interesting part of this exercise was the following. The question was posed, should the United States support with offensive weapons the government of Ukraine against Russian aggression? And guess what? Exactly those that had no clue where Ukraine was located were the ones that by a great majority were in favor of a very aggressive military position in Ukraine. So, this is the basic point. The US has been a reluctant hegemon because of geography, because of the Atlantic and the Pacific. To a certain extent, it always thought that it would be, let's say, didn't need to be heavily engaged in international affairs. So throughout history, typically we see a cyclical pattern in terms of American engagement. First, reluctance. This occurred World War I, occurred in World War II. Then aggressive intervention, and the cycle typically ends with withdrawal or indifference. I would argue that this period between 1945 and, for lack of a better point of reference, let's say 2016, it was an exceptional period. And people are going to regret the fact that we are now in this new world, because as Kagan and others have said, the jungle grows back. Because if you don't have an hegemon, even if it was a reluctant hegemon, then the possibilities of conflict increase dramatically. And what we are seeing is exactly this. But what was the structure? Well, you are familiar. Basically, with the end of World War II in 1944, we had the Bretton Woods meeting. Fernando was there, 750 delegates. Well, you were born 2 months later, but in spirit you were there. You had 44 countries, and of course the two luminaries were Keynes, the head of the British delegation, and Harry Dexter White, the head of the American delegation, subsecretary of the Treasury. And there were different plans. No surprise, the US plan prevailed. And the original main pillars were basically the creation of an institution to deal with macroeconomic financial imbalance, that's the IMF, an institution to facilitate resource transfer for reconstruction. So this was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, popularly known as the World Bank. Later on, other agencies were created under the umbrella of the World Bank Group, and also in the 1950s, several regional development banks, like, for instance, the Inter-American Development Bank. And then with respect to trade, originally there was an idea to create an institution that would be called the International Trade Organization. There was a conference in Havana, and it was exactly to create the rules of the game for a liberal trade world. But guess what? The US Congress did not support the creation of this institution So as a second best, an agreement, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was signed in 1947. And then, at the level of security and peace, the United Nations. So, all of this to say that we, under the leadership of the United States and the victors of World War II, but much more the United States, there was a system that led to this process of global governance that I characterize here as cooperative leadership that brings together national government, multilateral public agents, and civil society to achieve commonly accepted goals. But we have, of course, to recognize that it was a kind of dominance level of global governments. In reality, if you go to the United States or to the GATT at that point in time, you would argue, well, each country a vote. But of course, a vote of the United States would count a little bit differently from a vote from Guinea-Bissau. So it was a system of dominance. As time went by, several other ad hoc institutional structures were created, like the G7, G8, later on the G20. And the geopolitical situation, the Cold War, the ideological confrontation between market economies under the aegis of American leadership and the quote-unquote aberration of communism, of course, created incentives for this kind of system to be sustained. The collapse of the Soviet Union created this perception, probably all of you are familiar with the work of Francis Fukuyama, that at that point in time claimed that we have come to the end of history, that basically a trajectory towards democracy and free markets was inevitable, and we were getting there. Well, of course, history had a different view. And in reality, if we go to what is happening in the 21st century, and we could say that the 21st century started for sure on September 11, we have a situation that power is in flux. There is an ongoing debate, as I already mentioned, about the benefits of economic globalization versus focus on nation-state priorities. The nature of the state is being challenged. Terrorism, cyber terrorism. The EU experiment is under stress. And we have a series of problems, like, for instance, not a very effective platform for cooperation among two great powers, United States and China. And there is a certain ironic touch here, because in the past, if you were to simplify the world and say, well, the big confrontation was the United States and Soviet Union, of course you had on one side the United States in favor of globalization and the Soviet Union operating very much in terms of its spheres of influence. Nowadays, we have a situation that the United States is withdrawing from its position of support to globalization and multilateral institutions, and you have China, a communist country, at least in thesis, being the main proponent of globalization. And actually, a country that has benefited significantly from the multilateral structure that was created by the United States. But this also creates questions about what next. So what is the key challenge? Of course, economic growth, but particularly to achieve equilibrium while restraining the dogs of war. Because one thing that we know for sure is what is known as the Thucydides trap. As you are aware, Thucydides, an Athenian general, that wrote the history of the War of Peloponnesus between Sparta, the hegemonic city in the Greek peninsula, and Athens. And the basic point that he makes in this history is that every time that you, and I'm simplifying, but every time that you get an hegemonic power being confronted by a power that increases its military, economic, and trade capacity, this typically leads to war. So if you look at this graph here, you see that by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we had the United States and Germany confronting the UK, be it in terms of military power and in economic terms. This paved the way, in the case of Germany, to World War I. Later on, we have the Soviet Union being a major military power. You can see the proportion of military expenditures, although as an economic power was never a match to the market economies. And we had the Cold War, a different type of war. We didn't have a war with respect to the ascent of Japan in terms of the most recent recovery, because between 1950 and 1980, Japan was the economy that grew the fastest in the world. And do you know what was the second fastest growing economy in the world between 1950 and 1980? Now, I'm not going to bet an expensive bottle of wine because Fernando is giving me bottles of wine for free from Baja, California. So, but the answer is Brazil, okay? So these were the Chinas of the period, okay? So if you go back to the 1980s, you're gonna see many, many books being written about Japan as confronting the United States and taking over the control of the world economy. Of course, this didn't happen. But nowadays, we have the situation of China, okay? And China, as I already mentioned, is already the largest economy in the world, depending on what kind of dimension for exchange rate you use. Now, it is, by now, a multipolar world. Here are some numbers in terms of the size of GDP, in terms of population, and in terms of military expenditure. You can see that, of course, the European Union is still very important. Here we still have the United Kingdom as part of European Union, but you see the ascent of China, India, significant over these last decades. Russia, again, in economic terms, is no match for these economies. Russian economy is smaller than Brazilian economy, for instance, but in military terms, of course, it's a nuclear power. So, how you put all of this and you understand what is happening around the world in terms of what I characterize here as the populist wave. By populist, I mean basically politicians that come to power, eventually in democracies, but also in autocratic processes, but I'm particularly interested in the case of democracies, basically with messages that are simple messages to very complex problems, and typically wrong solutions. But they have some common characteristics. They are in favor of nationalism, they are anti-globalization, they are anti-migration, they have mistrust of multilateral institutions, multinationals, and intellectual elites. So the emphasis on the wisdom of the common man, woman, and resentment against the establishment, often combined with an autocratic style of governance. And I put here some names. We could discuss. Some of these are more to the right, actually the great majority, but are exceptions. I would argue here in Mexico you have an exception to this rule. But in any case, what we see is very similar to the experience around the world in terms of what happens when you have a financial crisis of global impact. And as you can see, typically the far left gains a little bit, but it's particularly the far right, the populist parties with right ideologies that gain significant additional votes after a crisis of global dimensions. And this has happened again after the global financial crisis. Typically, if you try to explain the vote, it's important to keep in mind that it's not only an economic perspective that explains the ascent of populist leaders around the world over the last 10 years or so. Of course, rising inequality in industrialized countries, concerns about trade, particularly the penetration of China, the issues associated with technology, the fact that technology seems to foster more inequality, but also a cultural backlash. Actually is a tension between young and old. Young that typically have adopted a much more secularist position, personal autonomy in favor of diversity versus religiosity, traditional family structures, conformity, and this also cuts across urban and rural environments. If you ask, for instance, who voted for Brexit, it's mainly rural, it's mainly older people, and you could ask, well, how come they won? Well, because young people didn't come to vote. And that's part of the explanation in the case of Brexit. But there is also an element of scapegoating, be it the immigrants, be it an external multilateral institution like the European Union, Brussels in the end, or issues like corruption. So it's a combination of these factors that in the end you can use to explain the ascent of populism. But you can see that if, for instance, we use the Freedom House type of characterization, that over the last few years, so after the global financial crisis, there was a significant increase in the number of governments, this is basically among G20 countries, that could be characterized as democracies, but with populist leaders, okay? So this is a very clear trend. How technology has to do with this? Well, the first thing is that we are living in a world that it's more and more connected, in a world that it's characterized by new modes of doing business and also how we interact with one another. You can see here poor Hillary Clinton in one of her big shows, but everybody is basically trying to take a selfie. How we play, how we engage in politics, right? These two examples here are fake accounts created by, everything leads to believe, agents of Russian interests. We cannot prove that Mr. Putin was behind it, but some people very close to him, yes. And you can see the kind of message that came in the use of this information. Why this is a problem? Because this new world that we are living is a world where information, some people characterize as the new oil, for instance. This coffee shop in Providence, you don't pay for the coffee. You go there and you provide your name, what kind of classes you are taking, and based on this information and the authorization to use this information in their database, you have access to the products. Well, we really don't know where this is going in terms of the impact of technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, big data, with respect to jobs, but certainly is creating an environment that can change many of our assumptions. For instance, we always believe that market economies are more efficient vis-a-vis central planned economies, autocracies. But in this world of big data, artificial intelligence, maybe things will change. Because, for instance, China already has more than 100 million people in database that they can use not only for economic reasons and new business plans, but also for social control. In a country like the United States, with all the proliferation of social networks, in reality, there are still pushback with respect to privacy, with democratic rights, that creates some tension. So what is going to happen in the future is not clear. But one thing that we know for a fact is that when we operate in networks, particularly in anonymous fashion, there is a tendency for us to operate much more with respect to our cognitive system in what Daniel Kahneman calls System 1. So it's basically our gut feeling, okay, rather than System 2, which is the part of our mind that operates with analysis, that controls self-interest. And the problem with System 1 is that System 1 is prone to mistakes, particularly what psychologists call confirmation bias. People tend to rely on System 1 when the information is consistent with their a priori beliefs. If you believe something and then you see a website or somebody sends a message in WhatsApp that reinforces that belief, your gut feeling is to immediately recognize this as true. And as we know, this, to a certain extent, social media magnifies the exploitation of cognitive bias. The rise of fake news is very much associated with this process. It fosters tribalism, meaning basically groups of people that think alike and now are not anymore divided by geography because of social networks that create echo chambers that reinforce pre-existing beliefs, for instance, in favor of access to weapons, against immigration, things like that. And also distortions of search engines. In the case of Brazil, for instance, there is already lots of support for the proposition that the search engines of YouTube that are based on popularity basically amplified a, let's say, nationalist message, and that because it was popular in some channels and the search engines try to, its algorithms to multiply the interest, the data mining would basically go to target susceptible audience to this kind of message. And this was very much behind the election of Mr. Jair Bolsonaro, a candidate that had no, let's say, political weight in Brazilian history, and basically with a social, very clever social network strategy was able to become the president of the 8th largest economy in the world. And to make things a little bit more complicated, technology also allows the dissemination of hate speech in an anonymous way. I don't know if you saw, for instance, with what just happened in El Paso, the guy used 8chan, which is a website in the deep web that it's very hard for you to track who is behind that information. So all of this, if you add the revival of protectionism, is something that gives reason for concern. We know that international trade has slowed down. This is not a surprise, but if you look at the trade income elasticity, it used to be close to 3 in the 1980s, meaning international trade was growing 3 times faster than world GDP, and nowadays it's basically 1. Well, you could say that this would be inevitable, and you can see here what is the outlook in terms of international trade. You can see that both for the next few years, we expect international trade and GDP growth to be more or less at the same level. This can be explained by a series of factors, be it the financial crisis and the impact that it had on international trade, geopolitical frictions, some structural components, for instance, global value chains that have been the most dynamic lever of international trade. They have begun to consolidate over the last few years, be it because of geopolitical risk, be it because of environmental stress. But I would call attention to what I would characterize as trade policy related. We have seen a significant increase in protectionist actions around the world, and also an example of global governance failure, which is the impasse and, to be very frank, the death of the Doha Development Agenda, meaning the first multilateral negotiations on trade under the WTO aegis. If you ask the private sector what are the big concerns nowadays in terms of economic risks, you can see that trade conflicts are at the very top of their concerns. And also geopolitical instability is very high, much higher than was the case a few years ago. And no surprise, this is the latest report from the WTO of July, basically showing the number of protectionist import restrictive measures taken by G20 countries. And you can see the dramatic increase over the last few years. And all of this, if we add factors like what we saw in the United Kingdom with the vote in favor of Brexit, of course, this vote, as I already mentioned, was very different if we go to Scotland and Northern Ireland vis-a-vis England and Wales. But typically, people that were more educated, people who were younger, people who were in urban centers were in favor of remaining with the European Union. And the opposite applies. What is going to happen? Well, I don't think nobody knows. But what we know for sure, George Osborne mentioned this in 2016 as being the greatest act of protectionism in British history. He may be a little bit exaggerating a little bit, but certainly we are entering uncharted waters if we look, for instance, the amount of trade of the UK with the European Union. This is the red part of these bars, be it with respect to exports, be it with respect to imports, and the dots are basically the most favored nation tariffs that will then apply if we have a hard Brexit, as everything suggests we are going to see on a very nice day, October 31st, Halloween. So, but maybe Mr. Boris Johnson can get a better deal, but I doubt very much. So that's one trend in favor of more protectionism. And then we have this gentleman. This is the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Every year makes a contest, what is the word of the year. And the word of the year in 2016 was surreal. And to understand the election of Donald Trump, of course, we have to go well beyond economic considerations. It is true that if you look, for instance, to the more labor-intensive industries in the United States, these industries have been significantly impacted by trade, and as a consequence, employment in these industries have declined significantly. But if you look at the history leading to the election of Donald Trump, you're going to see that actually Mr. Obama also had part of the guilt in this process in the following sense. In reality, it was only in his second term that he tried to advance a more aggressive trade agenda. The Democratic Party is not particularly fond of trade agreements. But in reality, when we saw the campaign of Donald Trump in 2016, the emphasis was basically on the voters left behind by globalization, the Chinese threat, and arguments about negative impact on international trade on the USA. Well, he is right. Inequality has been increasing significantly in the United States. That's why not only this topic was very, let's say, popular, not only with Trump, but also with some of the Democrat candidates like Bernie Sanders. It is also true that China has dramatically increased its trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States. And it's true that as Hillary Clinton, in her famous answer to the question, who is going to vote for Donald Trump, when she said, well, this is a bunch of deplorables, it's exactly the people with less education, with much poorer health conditions, also associated with levels of income, that typically voted for the Republican Party in large numbers compared to the votes that the Republican Party had for Mitt Romney in 2012. One thing that we cannot blame Mr. Trump is that he has surprised the world. If you look, for instance, at his agenda, this was, in the candidate's platform, things that he would withdraw from the TPP, that he would renegotiate NAFTA, that he would have a very, let's say, strong attitude vis-a-vis China, that would label China as a currency manipulator, and we could go on. So, in reality, he had announced all of this. More than that, he is the first president of the United States since the 1920s who specifically said that protection will lead to great prosperity and strength, right? This is his inaugural speech. Now, anybody who has studied economics understands that it's a little bit more complicated than that. For instance, just look at the graph with respect to employment in manufacturing in the United States, the graph to your right. And you'll see the red line is the manufacturing output in the United States. And as you can see, with the exception here of the hiccups in the recession associated with the internet bubble and later on the global financial crisis, production in manufacturing has been increasing significantly in the United States. Now, employment has been declining. The answer is very simple. Productivity has increased, technology has led to increasing production with less labor. And if you ask, well, why the United States has a current account deficit, the explanation is very simple. The current account is simply the other image of the savings investment relationship in a country. You can see that all countries that have more savings than investment will have a surplus in terms of current account. Those that have a deficit in current account are countries that invest more than savings, particularly if you are a country that has very high levels of consumption, as is the case in the United States. This is inevitable. And it's not through trade policy that you are going to change this. You may change under very specific circumstances. So what is Trump's doctrine with respect to trade? That's my interpretation. But it's basically the belief that bilateral trade deficits matter, which is bull, but he believes that they can be reduced through smart, tough negotiators, that job losses can also be reduced, and that tariffs are paid by the exporters, not by the consumers. And last but not least, that multilateral rules are a nuisance. If you put this together, you can see what countries are going to be the targets of the Trump administration. Countries that have a significant surplus in trade. What countries are that? Bilateral trade surplus. China, Canada, Mexico. So, and Japan. So, and Germany. So these are the countries that inevitably, if you believe in those things that I just listed, you are going to focus upon. Now, here a brief summary of what a trade war can do for you. And let's define a trade war as a situation in which a country abandons multilateral disciplines and starts adopting protectionist policies unilaterally, and this leads to reaction. So the basic question is the following. Does it make sense for a large economy to pursue such policies? In theory, if a country is large enough, like the United States, it can affect the price of its imports and exports because it has market power. So in theory, there is what economists call the optimal tariff. But this has a series of assumptions behind it, in particularly the assumption that the other countries affected are not going to retaliate, right? This is not the case. We are seeing a situation in which we see a spiral of retaliations around the world, and this is only going to get worse if Mr. Trump really goes ahead with the additional tariffs on the U.S. Interestingly enough, you probably saw that yesterday they announced that instead of putting the tariffs as of September, is only going to be in December, for a very simple reason. This will not affect the price in retail for Christmas, right? But most likely we are going to see an increase in the tariffs against the United States. And that's where things are going. So you can see the trajectory of U.S. tariffs over time, and now with this several adjustment in tariffs, significant increase over the last few years. The red part of the line are still hypothetical, but it can get very, very high. And to the point of Mr. Trump saying that the impact is on the exporter, we have already evidence. The black line are for sectors that have not been affected by the tariffs. And the other lines show the relative price of products, particularly from China, that have been affected by tariffs. And you can see that who, in the end, is paying for this are the consumers in the American market. But it goes well beyond tariffs. We are in a moment in which the U.S. is using its whole arsenal of trade instruments. And I would like to call your attention particularly to the so-called Section 232, which is part of the 1962 Trade Act that allows, in theory, the United States, the president, the executive, to impose trade restrictions based on concepts of national security. And why is this so dangerous? Well, it started with steel and aluminum. And as you know, among the countries affected were countries like Canada, Mexico, Brazil. So some of the closest, quote-unquote, allies of the United States. To argue that there is a national security threat, of course, is a big joke. But the biggest implication of the use of this kind of instrument, and there is one major case waiting to be decided, which is the instruction, the report of the Department of Commerce that has now recommended tariffs of 25% on imports of automobiles in the United States under the explanation that they pose a security threat to the American economy. Again, it's a joke, but if this happens, then the world economy is really going to tank. And the decision will have to be taken till the end of this year. The expectation is that by November, this decision will be taken. But this has major implications for the WTO, because typically countries would, let's say, shy away of disputing national security arguments, because if two countries are engaged in a war, yes, people understand that they may impose restrictions on trade. But when the largest economy in the world began to use this argument, everybody else feels much more comfortable to use this argument. I don't know if you are following what is happening between Japan and Korea, but actually Japan is using national security arguments to put restrictions on exports to South Korea of some chemical products, which makes no sense at all. But, of course, if the United States can do, why I can't do it also? So all of this is creating problems. Here is just an example of how the world has entered a phase of tit for tat. So Mr. Trump initiates protectionist attitudes, then be it Canada, be it Mexico, be it China, in particular China, but also the European Union counterattack. And all of this, of course, is affecting the world trade to a large extent. And it's interesting to see the difference between the moment that we are living and what happened, for instance, in the 1980s. In the 1980s, when the threat was considered the Japanese expansion, Japanese exports, there was a significant pressure in the United States for the increase in protectionism. And yet, James Baker at the time was able to negotiate what became known as the Plaza Agreement, and later on the Louvre Accord. Both, but particularly the Plaza Accord, was an attempt of the G7 countries to devalue the US by active intervention in markets to diminish protectionist pressure. So foreign exchange interventions were used as a mechanism to fight a protectionist threat. Nowadays, we have the other side of the coin. The US strategy nowadays is to minimize foreign exchange movements, to anchor foreign exchange rates, and actually is including in trade agreements foreign exchange clause, exactly expecting that its protectionist interventions will do the magic in terms of balanced trade. This, of course, leads us to another point of contention, which is the just definition, the just declaration of China as a currency manipulator. To be very frank, China has intervened in the market in the past, but it has not been doing this in the way that the United States is accusing for the last 10 years. Actually, it has been doing exactly the opposite. It has been sustaining the renminbi, the yuan, so not to allow market force to lead to a depreciation. Why it has been doing this? Exactly because it's interested in making the renminbi to become a currency recognized internationally as a currency of reference. So there are three criteria that by the Treasury Department, the United States has to pursue to identify a country as a currency manipulator. First, that it has a significant trade surplus, as of now $20 billion vis-a-vis the US, that has a material account surplus larger than 2% of the economy GDP, and Also that the economy has engaged in persistent one-sided intervention in the foreign exchange market with a view basically to depreciate the currency. So here you can see the countries that are analyzed by the Treasury Department. This is the latest report from the Treasury Department. The numbers in red is where a country is failing one of the three criteria. And you can see that nobody fails the three criteria. China, for instance, only fails the bilateral trade criteria. And yet, Mr. Trump decided to declare a currency manipulator. So, what does all of this mean? You can see the significant increase in terms of coverage of Chinese imports by trade restrictions in the United States. This is what probably is going to happen if in December the additional $200 billion, $300 billion are affected. So on average, the tariffs that Chinese imports in the United States will be around 21%. And what is very interesting also to mention is that China, in its retaliation, is targeting very specifically areas of interest of the Trump supporters, like, for instance, agribusiness. And you can see the significant difference nowadays between what a country like Mexico or Brazil, for that matter, pays on average MFN tariffs in China, 6.7%, vis-a-vis the average for the United States, which is already 20%. So bottom line is that the retaliations of China are beginning also to bite, to have a cost. And you can see that this is already having an impact in terms of trade between the US and the United States. Now, just to finalize, this goes well beyond the question of trade. As we discussed briefly, it has a geopolitical dimension, it has a technological dimension. You are all familiar with the discussion about the role of Huawei and the concerns about this company that probably has the most advanced technology for 5G networks is facing, under the assumption that it may be influenced by the Chinese government. So this company is being affected, of course, but the other side of the coin is that companies like Google also are beginning to face significant issues in terms of the Chinese market. And the externalities are quite interesting. Look, for instance, what happened with the price of soybeans in Brazil and Argentina vis-a-vis the price of soybeans in the United States because of the Chinese retaliation. It increased dramatically in Brazil and Argentina, and it declined in the United States. This come till the beginning of 2019, when a truce was established. By now, again, we are going to see a divergence, and of course, this creates short-term benefits for countries like Brazil and Argentina. So, Mr. Trump basically generated the situation that I characterize here at the end of Pax Americana and the kind of world that we saw emerging after World War II. And in terms of the scenarios with respect to trade, you can pick your choice. Scenario one is already long gone because we are in scenario two in terms of the kind of actions that the Trump administration is taking. And who knows, we may enter scenario three that in an extreme situation could even lead to the United States leaving the WTO. And you all have seen this picture, right? It's not only China. You can see that some of the closest allies in economics and geopolitical terms are being significantly affected by the actions of the United States. And here is how Mr. Trump sees the world. And you'll be very happy to learn that Mexico is at the very top of his preoccupations in terms of the number of tweets that he sends. Countries like Brazil don't even appear in the picture. Venezuela, a little bit. But it's China, North Korea, Russia, France, and Puerto Rico, well, quote unquote, a country, and Mexico very much. So, to finish this, when I talk about multilateralism in crisis, and I'm going to focus here in the case of the WTO, but we could discuss the World Bank, the IMF, but I'm going to focus on the WTO because the focus is trade. I'm not going to go through the trajectory that took us from the GATT to the WTO, but as you are aware, I'm sure, the Doha Development Agenda was launched in 2001 and has gone to very difficult negotiations, but basically it has been in limbo over the last few years. At the Bali Ministerial in 2013, you were there, right? So we both were there. There was some progress, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, an important agreement, but as I said at that moment, and it didn't make me very popular in the WTO, I said that what happened in Bali is more or less like what will happen when I die and Fernando comes to say an eulogy. And what I would like him to say is, look, he's moving. So basically, this is what the Trade Facilitation Agreement meant. Yes, there was some movement, but not much more than that. Actually, by Nairobi, by the ministerial in Nairobi, it became very clear that most countries were not ready to support the continuation of the negotiations. In theory, the negotiations are still ongoing, but it's very clear that if we look what has happened in terms of trade policies around the world, you can see that at multilateral level, from a period of euphoria in parallel with the end of history to the situation today where the WTO is in deep trouble. Also with respect to preferential agreements, from a significant explosion of preferential agreements and even negotiations of the so-called mega regional, but taking us to the current situation with the death of TPP. Of course, the 11 countries outside the United States are still involved in a parallel agreement that is based on the original TPP. But overall, we have a situation, and including what has happened with NAFTA, with the appearance of the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, which is much less liberal than NAFTA because it has a strong emphasis on managed trade through rules of origin. And we'll have to see if it's going to pass authorization by Congress. And blatant unilateralism. So it's quite clear that we are in the red in terms of, let's say, alarm signals with respect to the multilateral trade system. If you want to be an optimist, you would say, well, the WTO trade negotiations are just the tip of the iceberg. The WTO has many other functions, important functions, in terms of the rules of the game. That's true. But one of the major functions of the WTO is exactly the dispute settlement system. And this is also under attack simply because the United States is not supporting the authorization for new judges. And as of November this year? December this year, yeah, we're gonna have not enough. Yeah, so typically you need 3 to adjudicate an appeal in the WTO dispute settlement. So I'll leave with you this message from Robert Gilpin, something he said in the 1970s. A liberal international economy cannot come in existence and be maintained unless it has behind it the most powerful states in the system. And at this point in time, definitely the most powerful state in the system does not support the system. So, if you ask me what is happening with globalization, globalization has declined, be it if you look in terms of capital flows, be it in terms of trade, be it in terms particularly with respect to foreign direct investment. But it's also true that if we look at the other dimensions of globalization, the process continues, particularly in terms of cross-border flows of information and the infrastructure behind it. So it's a mixed message. Where are we going? I would argue that in terms, if you look in terms of sustained growth and the importance of global governance, of course, we would like to be in this part of the world so that the process of globalization would continue to be sustained, but we have to realize that this has implications for the environment, that this has implications in terms of income distribution, and you have to adopt the right policies to adjust to these situations. But if you ask me, where do you think the world is going? I think that at this point in time, we are probably living in this part in terms of what I call MOS, more of the same stuff. So low growth, multilateral institutions under attack, and growing inequality, populism thriving, and anxiety. The danger with this scenario is that I don't think it's a stable scenario. And the danger is that we can very quickly move here to a system based on spheres of influence, as we saw in the 1930s. It's quite obvious that China is investing very efficiently in increasing its influence in Asia, particularly with the Belt and Road Initiative. And all of this, of course, may lead to confrontations that, in the end, can take us to this scenario, which, of course, would be a nightmare for everybody. So, have we reached peak globalization? My answer to this is yo, a combination of yes and no. Yes, in certain dimensions, but I expect the process of globalization to continue. But in the short term, we have this significant danger. The Trump administration does not support the United States playing the role of indispensable nation, to use Madeleine Albright characterization. And this is a problem because if you don't have the hegemonic country playing this role, of course, we can fall back in what economists call the Kindleberg trap, which was what happened in the 1930s, where no country was willing or able to exert global leadership. And this led to trade conflicts, a growing gap in the provision of global public goods. We can see what is happening with the climate change agreement. And if you ask me, is multilateralism dead? I would say that no, it's not dead, but definitely the multilateralism that we knew, particularly with respect to trade, is now under lots of stress. And the questions that we have to ask is, can the WTO be reformed? Can plurilateral agreements based on a critical mass criteria, for instance, create the way forward in terms of trade negotiations? Our obvious question is, are the current US trade policies the new normal or a temporary glitch? And I would argue that, unfortunately, they are much more likely to be a new normal, because if there is one thing where Democrats and Republicans agree, is that they see China as a threat. And although I wouldn't expect, if a Democrat candidate is elected next year in the US, to have the same kind of policies that Trump is following, with respect to China, I don't expect major change. And this brings back to the WTO, for instance. Can it properly deal with state capitalism, which in the end is the China question? And basically, who is going to lead this new phase of protectionism? And for those of you who like football, you probably are aware that there are World Cups for robots, right? And Pep Guardiola, I imagine all of you know who I'm talking about, the current coach of Manchester City. He visited MIT Media Lab a few years ago, and the students were very happy with his visit and made a demonstration of the robots playing football. And they told him, look, our robots are becoming very, very good. We have one already that is as good as Neymar. He can roll in the floor. In 10 years, we are going to get one as good as Messi. So would you be willing to become the coach of the MIT robot football team? And the answer of Pep Guardiola for me is the best explanation of what is leadership. He said, no, I'm not interested. Because in the case of robots, you basically enter the code and the robot is going to do what you set it in the code for it to perform. Leadership is basically for you to be able to influence your team, to influence your allies, to follow a vision. And this is exactly what we are missing nowadays. So if you ask me, is multilateralism dead? I would argue that the multilateralism that we learned to appreciate and lived with all its flaws in the post-World War II, it's going through major change, and I don't think there is a way back. I like very much this sign from a meteorological station in Norway that says the following: theory is when you understand everything but nothing works. Practice is when everything works but nobody understands why. At this station, theory and practice are united, so nothing works and nobody understands why. So this is pretty much where I am today, and thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, I would argue that this is already happening, okay? But we have to remember, with different values. I'm not saying that they are wrong or right, but they are different, right? So what is happening with institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, with the reserve arrangements that China has pioneered since the global financial crisis, to a certain extent, are parallel arrangements to the IMF, parallel arrangements to the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and also with the Belt and Road Initiative, it's creating a whole new sphere of influence that we can understand why they are doing this. But the big difference is, if you were to ask why China is not exercising its renewed economic power in institutions like the WTO, to take a leadership in the process of the Doha negotiations. Why is not doing so, be it in the IMF or the World Bank? For my sins, I was the person in charge of the negotiations of capital increase of the World Bank Group in 2010. And I can tell you, China was extremely pragmatic in the process of the negotiations because it knew that as we use the GDP as one of the variables to define the shareholding of each country, no matter what formula you were to use, China was going to increase significantly because last time that China had gone, or the World Bank had gone through a capital increase was in the 1970s. Since then, China had become the second largest economy in the world. And the problem is 100% is 100%. If somebody is going up, somebody is coming down. Who was coming down? Basically European countries, right? So China was very careful to avoid derailing the negotiations. So in the end, it accepted taking less of shares than it would be entitled if we were to use the formula stricto sensu. So this is to say that China can be very pragmatic when it sees an alignment with its interests. But on the other hand, it's not willing, for instance, to forget the recently acceded member type of attitude with respect to the WTO and to make concessions that could eventually help with the process of finalize the Doha round. Of course, I'm simplifying things here because there are many other problems. But I agree with implicitly what I think you were suggesting, that to a certain extent, is much more likely for us to see China not being, let's say, taking a position of leadership in institutions that were created by Western powers, and putting much more emphasis in creating new spheres of influence, particularly in Asia, through its initiatives. And this is what is happening right now.
Very quickly, I cannot help asking you, what do you think about the full-spirited trap at the present time? Do you think there are signs that at the end there might be a conflict?
I guess I mentioned this last week when we were having this class, that people like Steve Bannon, who was an advisor of Mr. Trump and still is closely aligned with the Trump administration, he is on records by saying that he thinks it's inevitable, a conflict with China. And he goes one step beyond, that given that this is inevitable, it's better to have this conflict now, where the United States still has an upper hand, than later. I'm not saying that this is right. I'm just saying that he's on record saying this, okay? Now, if you ask me, is the Thucydides trap a good description of reality? Of course not, okay? We have seen, even with respect to the Soviet Union, with respect to Japan, other moments in history where the hegemonic power was contested, and this led to a Cold War, led to trade conflicts, but not necessarily to war. But what is different this time is that the chances of an accident are increasing significantly, simply because the United States still has a very strong presence, for instance, in Asia, right? And we are going to see, we are already seeing, China projecting its military power in the South China Sea, a conflict with Vietnam or Japan or the Philippines may happen by an accident. And, well, Hong Kong right now, right? And what you are going to do, for instance, Tiananmen Square, could it happen again in Hong Kong? And what the Western world is going to do. So these are problems that go well beyond Mr. Trump. What I'm saying is that the institutions that we used to rely upon are now under siege, particularly the World Trade Organization. And this doesn't help. I don't see China willing to exert a leadership in structures that it had little saying in its origins, in the rules of the game to a certain extent. It will, as I already mentioned, go in a direction that I would argue is a direction of creating its own spheres of influence. This, of course, increases the chance of us seeing a world that goes in the direction of polarization. This is what we saw in the 1930s. Will this then lead us to a military catastrophe? I don't know. My crystal ball is as good as yours. I hope not.
So, do you think countries will be forced to take sides? Do you think countries will be forced to take sides? If that's so, what should we do? What Mexico and Brazil and other Latin American countries should do?
Well, I didn't talk much about Mr. Putin, but Mr. Putin recently, in a conference, people posed exactly this question to him. And he quoted a Chinese proverb saying that when the tigers fight in the valley, the smart monkey sits in the tree and waits to see who is going to win. Of course, if things come to a real confrontation, people will have to take sides. But in the environment that we live today, which there is a new type of Cold War, I would argue, I can't speak for Mexico, but and I can't speak for Brazil either, since I'm not a government official, but as a Brazilian, I would be strongly in favor of not taking sides, okay? There are issues where the alignment of a country like Brazil, and I would argue Mexico, are much closer to the United States, like emphasis on democratic rights, etc. On the other hand, for Brazil, Brazil and Argentina are the only two countries in the world that can really respond to the increasing demand for food that we are going to see and protein from China, okay? So the health of the Chinese economy is extremely important for these two economies. I would argue for Mexico not as much, but definitely it would help a world economy in good shape, that it's growing and that has no trade conflicts. I don't know if I answer your question. I think it's a little bit to ask what Winnie the Pooh and Alexander the Great have in common, besides the same middle name, but it's more or less what I would argue. Be careful at this point in time because things can get hot. Yeah?
In those scenarios, can you see a role for Europe?
Definitely. Of course, we didn't have time to talk much about different regions of the world. There is an important role for Europe to play, but we have to remember that in terms of military power, okay, Europe, although there is the alliance, NATO, that provides the umbrella for Europe, and this has been very much under attack by Mr. Trump, another example of the damage to multilateral institutions, if you will, if you would characterize NATO as such. But one thing that, and this is what I characterize as the exceptionalism of this Pax Americana. If you contrast, for instance, with the Pax Britannica, the UK was much more aloof in relation to the continental Europe. It had the control of the seas, and as long as Germany did not dispute that, it would not intervene directly in the continent. Then things got complicated. We had World War I. But nowadays in Europe, the great fear that I have is Russia. Because if you think about the history of Russia, is a history that sees the Baltic countries, and I would go even Poland and Ukraine, definitely, as part of its sphere of influence. So Mr. Putin is on the record saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And I strongly believe that what we are seeing by the use of technology, what is called cyber warfare, that the Russian government is directly involved because it has an interest in instability in democratic countries. The values are very different, okay? So will Europe be ready, let's say, if tomorrow Russia decides to do with the Baltic countries what it did with Ukraine, with Crimea in particular? I don't know, okay? I would doubt it would be ready to react if the United States is not ready to react. And at this point in time in the cycle of, let's say, engagement of the United States with the rest of the world, we are exactly in the period of withdrawal, but more than that, damage to the institutions that could eventually avoid this kind of conflict. So Europe has an important role to play, but right now Europe has some critical problems to deal with, particularly the situation of Brexit, right?
Going back a little to the WTO, considering the reform that is gaining power inside the organization and it's outside of them, for example, with G20 members pushing for this reform, what do you think will be the real range of this reform if we need to consider core values of this organization, or with a simple new round of negotiations will be sufficient?
Well, definitely it goes well beyond, let's say, the question of negotiations. That's why I put that picture of the iceberg. Multilateral trade negotiations are like riding a bike. If you stop, you fall, right? So they are important, and the failure of the Doha Development Agenda negotiations has affected the WTO. But there are several other things that all the member countries are responsible. For instance, countries like Brazil, with its emphasis on agricultural trade, saying, well, we are only going to negotiate other aspects of the agenda once we have a solution to the valid, let's say, claims of Brazil, Argentina, and countries with very competitive agribusiness sectors with respect to protectionism in Europe, in Japan, and in other places of the world. But in doing this, it basically closed the door to deals that could be made if you had a broader agenda that would include manufactured products, services, etc. And on top of that, the question that the world is changing very fast. I used to be, when I left the World Bank and I was a professor at IMD, I was the director of a group in support of multilateral trade and liberalism called the Avian Group at IMD in Switzerland. And I remember once we had a meeting with, this was an IMD meeting with CEOs of companies. So there were, I don't know, 90 CEOs of some of the largest companies in the world, like Nestlé, Johnson & Johnson, etc. And I made a presentation, and after that, in each table, we had a group of CEOs. So I asked them, and this is 2013, okay? I asked the CEOs that were in my table, what is the word that comes to your mind when I say WTO? And two of them immediately answer frustration. Because the velocity of trade negotiations and the velocity of the private sector are in very different worlds. Nowadays, the WTO would have to be much more assertive in topics like digital trade, the implications of the rules of investment and trade for global value chains. Now, how to open this agenda when you were not able to advance in the original agenda of the DDA? A country like India, for instance, would say, no, no, no. We cannot open new topics till we solve the agenda of the DDA. But by now, we have 18 years of quote-unquote negotiations. And of course, if you ask me, it's going nowhere. So is there a chance of renewal? Yes. I think that in the end, people will realize that if it is not the WTO, we need something like the WTO, right? So people will return to the table at a certain point in time. But for this, and that's the point that I made in the beginning, you need leadership. And the moment that we live in the history of mankind, in the post-World War II period, was a very unusual moment in which you had an hegemon willing to play this role. Nowadays, this hegemon is not willing to play this role, and I don't see anybody else really willing to play this role, and even able to play this role, okay? The main, let's say, benefit of the liberal order in the post-World War II period is something that people often do not recognize, was the fact that two of the most militaristic nations of the world, Japan and Germany, became democracies interested in focusing on economic competition and not in geopolitical power. And this has contributed tremendously for the change that we have seen in the world economy. Now, all of this is collapsing.
Today is 15 August. And to the day, it is 48 years that Richard Nixon declared that the dollar was no longer pegged to gold, and also introduced a 15% increase in tariffs. And at the time, it was the end of the world. Fortunately, it didn't happen. And though Nixon was as well, I'm not going to use any kind of adjective, but I believe that Trump is even worse than Nixon. But still, I believe that we will survive Trump, and but it's going to take a long time, as it took a long time for to adjust to what was done 48 years ago. So just let's hope for the best.
With this message of hope, I cannot do anything better. So let's hope.
Well, Ambassador De Matteo just told me he uploaded to Facebook a message about your conference, and he said, Professor Braga has just given a masterful lecture about the world economy, and we appreciate very much his presence here. I think I can just repeat that message. I think it really was a masterful. You really covered a lot of ground. You illuminated a lot of the main issues that are, important for the future of the world economy and the future of the international trade system. We really appreciate it, and we are enjoying your presence in Mexico, and the members of the Diplomado probably will continue enjoying. We have the fortune of having you for 2 more days, 8 hours more. They don't have an alternative, but I think they will enjoy it. I'm certainly sure. And we really, as we do when people like you come and we offer a small presence, this is a series, the series in the Colegio called the minimum histories and different topics. This is the one about the cosmos. Cosmos in English is el cosmos. And apparently it has been getting very good reviews. I'm sure you can read Spanish as far as I understand. And so we really appreciate your having been here. We will continue enjoying 2 days, but and in behalf of all the public here, I really thank you very much and ask for an applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.